You're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. Okay, that's a great start.
That's an awesome
Welcome
way to
everyone.
start.
Well, you see, look, I'm interviewing not only the esteemed Dr. Lance Bush, but Lance is a friend of mine. So, there might be a little bit of an informal vibe to this discussion, although we'll be asking very serious questions that I wondered for years, and we'll get them all answered today. So, especially concerning metaethics. Lance, do you want to talk, a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a background in philosophy and psychology. I did a master's in philosophy at Tufts. Then I finished up a PhD last year in psychology at Cornell. And it's a little difficult to, when people hear a PhD in psychology, they think, oh, you're a psychologist then. But my research is really interdisciplinary. I work in moral psychology and I've done, your sort of standard social psychological research. But a lot of my research, even the empirical side of it, has this philosophical angle to it. And my primary area of research is the psychology of metaethics, which looks at how do people that don't have, we're not talking about philosophers, but we're talking about philosophical topics. And the question really is, how do people without a whole bunch of philosophical training think about metaethical issues, questions about the fundamental nature of morality? And the big question I focus on is moral realism. Are ordinary people, are non-philosophers moral realists, or are they something else? And it's a pretty small literature. There's not a ton of people working on that, but it became a huge interest of mine. And in the course of that research, I started to be really concerned about the studies that were being run. I started to question, maybe the participants in these studies don't understand what the questions are asking them in the way that the researchers intend. And that's not because people that participate in studies don't have the training in philosophy. That's not the only reason. And it's not like they're just like, they didn't get it. It's that these questions are ambiguous in ways that are interesting and complicated, and it creates this fascinating disconnect when you recognize that when researchers ask questions that are based on concepts that are common in academic philosophy to people without that training, they often fail to appreciate that they're using language in a way that can have lots of different interpretations outside of philosophical context. And what I ended up finding in my research is that people would interpret a seemingly, if you have a background in philosophy, straightforward philosophical question in a whole bunch of ways unrelated to what researchers intended, and that these measures were just generally invalid. And there's a long circuitous route that I go through where I end up arguing, and what I ended up thinking is maybe the people are not interpreting these questions the way the philosophers intend because they don't have views on these philosophical issues in the first place. Now, I've told people this sometimes. I've like presented this view, and sometimes the reaction people have is, well, obviously, of course they don't. But weirdly, philosophers seem to operate on this presumption. I'm not saying all philosophers, but a lot of analytic philosophers have what I take to be unusual views about language and human psychology. And they seem to be operating on the assumption that when people go out saying things and thinking things and doing things, that their actions and their words and their ways of thinking implicitly conform to the categories and distinctions and principles of interest to academic philosophers, as if we all have this sort of we're like implicit partisans to different philosophical views, and it's all wrapped up in our language and our ways of thought. And by analyzing our ways of thinking and our ways of speaking, we could figure out what those secret philosophical views are. And I just don't see any particularly good reason to think that that's true. So that's where my research has taken me. And it has, I think that when you reorient your perspective on language and human psychology, it has huge implications for philosophy. And at the same time, I also think, it's not like we could just take psychology and like rip apart a lot of philosophical assumptions. That doesn't mean philosophy doesn't have a huge role in assisting psychological research as well. So, a lot of times psychologists are insensitive to categories and distinctions that may actually be important. So a lot of my research is at that intersection between philosophy and psychology and how both fields can mutually inform and critique one another.
Okay, so part of the frustration, I think, where perhaps you're somewhat motivated to do all this kind of research is that when you talk to philosophers, or just not even necessarily philosophers, there's broad claims about what people think, and so I bet I guess what I'm putting together is that in part you're interested in what people out there might think about these questions about how we think about right or wrong, good or bad. But you're questioning the very methodologies by which other people try to arrive at how they think about right or wrong, good or bad, or morality. So, is that like a decent summary of?
Yeah, you could kind of awkwardly call it like meta ethics, because I'm studying how we should do meta ethics, so it's kind of extra meta. I really like meta stuff.
Okay, so let's say we pull someone off the street, okay, and you want to know what they think about right or wrong metaethically, and maybe let me just ask you, what when we're doing metaethics, what are we doing in a brief nutshell before I ask this question?
So, metaethics as a branch of philosophy is a branch of philosophy dedicated to studying the fundamental nature of morality. So, it's asking more abstract questions. So, typically, moral philosophy is split up into three categories. There's applied ethics, which deals with like what's right or wrong in this specific case. Is abortion right or wrong? Is euthanasia right or wrong? It deals with the specific application of moral principles to particular cases. And that's a sort of, you could call it the bottom level, or the most concrete level. Then you have the sort of intermediate level, and it's intermediate in terms of level of abstraction, and that's normative ethics. And that's where a lot of the moral philosophy work goes on, and a lot of people are familiar with this. And that typically you have these like big competing theories, deontology, utilitarianism or consequentialism, virtue ethics. And what that's doing is trying to construct systems, principles, like it's the overarching theory for governing our first order moral judgments. Like, what is it that actually makes an action right or wrong? And that sort of tables the metaethical questions. So, okay, so we've got this notion that there's a right or wrong. What is it that actually makes things right or wrong? Is it that they're right or wrong in terms of the consequences, right or wrong in terms of we locate the rightness or wrongness in the type of action or the principles themselves. So you get these rule-based systems. Is it really about the kind of people we are? So it's more about character. So you have these different approaches at that level where you're basically operating under the presumption that you've got something to work with there, and then you come up with these moral theories for governing your sort of system of principles of right and wrong. Then metaethics sits on top. You could flip this if you want. I'm not trying to say metaethics is better because it's on top, but that deals with more abstract questions. And what's interesting about metaethics is that it sort of cross-cuts all the sort of major branches of philosophy. So it's not just ethics. It deals with metaphysical questions, like what actually are moral facts, if there are such things. It deals with epistemological questions. If there is moral knowledge, like how could we acquire it? Like how do you actually access these moral facts, if there are such things, epistemically? And then it deals with you could say the more prosaic questions that are sort of part of moral philosophy proper.
Okay.
Like what is morality? So it's dealing with those questions. But one of the disputes in metaethics is whether there are these stance independent or objective moral facts. That might be the biggest dispute between moral realists and anti-realists. But there are other topics in metaethics. One common one is moral motivation. Like what's the connection between moral belief and moral motivation? And there's other topics as well.
Okay. So my question. So we pull someone off the street. Okay. So using what you just explained, if we were to ask them, do you think abortion should be legalized? We're asking kind of more the concrete applied ethics kind of question. Now, but if we ask that person, what do you think makes this abortion right or wrong? Like, what is the secret ingredient for you that makes it right or wrong or good or bad, whatever? That's more of the normative ethics. Am I understanding that?
It would be an ambiguous question because a person could interpret that as a normative moral question, or they could interpret it as a metaethical question. So if you ask a person on the street, hey, what's your stance on abortion? Are you for it or are you against it? Often people have more nuanced positions. They're for it up until a certain point or something like that. And if you then say, oh, and they tell you their position, and you say, okay, well, why? What do you think it is that makes it wrong? A person could say, oh, well, I think that it's not wrong up until a certain point because the fetus isn't conscious, and so it's not capable of harm, and I ground my views about what's right or wrong in terms of whether it causes harm. And that would be a person that appears to be giving some sort of utilitarian rationale, and that would be a normative ethical rationale. But a person might also say, I think it's impermissible from the moment of conception because God determines what's right or wrong. And that person might be giving you a metaethical
Okay.
Yeah, so they might be giving you a metaethical position. And so it just like the person could interpret it in one or another way. So the question itself would have to be disambiguated to really know whether it's really a question about metaethics or normative ethics.
Okay. So notice that when I first asked about, do you think abortion should be legalized? You were fine to say that it was more concrete. If you wanted to ask a general normative ethical question in that middle space, what would be a question you'd ask that would be less likely to be misinterpreted as either metaethical or applied?
That's a good question. Two things. One, I don't ask a lot of normative moral questions, so I don't have a lot of experience with what works in practice. And the second that sort of plays off of that is in like what's a good question to ask people if your goal is to get them to interpret you as intended is actually an empirical question. So we could sit from the armchair and say, this would be a good question or that would be a good question. But good psychological research involves getting feedback from participants and finding out how they interpret the questions. Just to give you an idea, first of all, obviously there's going to be big cross-cultural differences in what kind of questions you can ask, how to ask the questions, what phrasing to use. But the same question, like a lot of research in moral psychology is developmental research with children, because people are interested in how do children acquire moral concepts? When do their views about morality come online and how do they develop? And the kinds of questions you would ask children would differ from the kinds of questions you would ask adults. So already you could see that the precise wording you use is going to vary from one context to another. And if I was asking philosophers or professionals in a particular epidemiologists or lawyers, you might use different phrasing that would be more appropriate for your target audience. So that's the first thing. People vary. And if you're targeting specific populations for particular kinds of research questions, you need to be mindful of that. The second is there might be unknown features of how people interpret questions that researchers might think this is a better question than that question, but like you just have to ask people and find out. All of that was actually just a delay tactic for me to try to figure out what would be a good question to ask. Because, the kinds of questions you would ask philosophers, like the most obvious and blunt way to ask a philosopher is, well, what normative theory do you endorse? Mm-hmm. But of course, if you ask like a non-philosopher that, they're going to go, what? They're just not going to know what you mean. So what I suspect would be the best way to ask them would be to ask a semi-structured question that presents them with some options. So for instance, once you get a person's stance on the trolley problem or whatever, you could then say, okay, well, what do you think it is that makes it the case that this action is right or wrong? Is it that it's wrong because of the harmful consequences that would come about from performing the action? Is it the action itself that's right or wrong because there's a rule or principle you endorse that would tell us whether it's right or wrong? Or is it right or wrong because, it's not the sort of thing that a good person would do, or it's only the sort of thing that a bad person would do? And that would sort of ratchet the person's responses into a prearranged structure that would immediately give them a context where they understand, they're asking me this kind of question. And they don't need to understand the distinction between normative ethics or metaethics to answer that question. But there's big trade-offs when you do that. The moment you do that, you're sort of funneling their answers down a particular line of thought that may not reflect what they would have thought if you didn't put those restrictions on them in the first place. Like, for instance, if you ask someone, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? A lot of people are going to maybe, potentially default to vanilla or chocolate. But what if you gave them a list? Like, you're like vanilla, chocolate, so on and so forth, and their favorite flavor is not on there. Well, now they can't pick it. Or what if you give them weird flavors? Like, you're just like, I don't know, guava, papaya, like it's just tropical fruits. And they're like, I don't like any of those. I want chocolate. So when researchers design questions, you have to face trade-offs with how open-ended or how tightly restricted your questions are. And that has all sorts of methodological implications. And the same thing would happen if you were just asking a person on the street about their views. So what you face here is a trade-off, which is that the more specification you give the person, the more you're doing a number of things. One, you could end up presenting them with a forced choice between responses that don't reflect their actual views. Two, you could be leading them. You wouldn't want to ask someone, if a witness was on the witness stand, you wouldn't want to say, a good question is, where were you on the night of the murder? You wouldn't want to say, were you at the club of the night of the murder or were you at home? Because now you're presuming that it was one or the other. What if they want to say something else? So And in that context, that person, because there's a definitive answer, if they weren't in one of those two, they might say, I wasn't in either of those, I was at work. But when a person is in a context where they're not really sure and they need some guidance from you, you're asking them a weird question they're not familiar with. And you say, is it A or is it B? One is they might just pick one because it's like cognitively easy to just latch on to the options you're given. In addition, it might be considered impolite to sort of reject the structure of your question. Another is that if this person is filling out, like there's a difference between surveys and just talking to people. If a person's filling out a survey and it's A or B and there's no other options, too bad. You can not answer the question, but there's usually not C other, and then you write something in. And even if there is, people seem I don't know. They seem to lack a motivation to do that. That seems like, maybe too much work, or maybe you recognize if you do that, it's not going to help the researchers. There's a whole bunch of things psychologically that could go on that could make people deviate. I feel like I'm giving too much detail on how to answer questions, but my whole bread and butter when I do my research is how to ask good questions and how to figure out how people are interpreting questions. And it is just an absolutely rich territory that is largely unexplored by philosophers or psychologists. A lot of philosophers will say, well, when I ask questions in my class, most of the students give this answer. And I think that they totally fail to appreciate that students might have background knowledge about the professor's position that biases them, or the professor could ask in a leading tone, or the professor could structure the question in a way that leads people down one path or another. I think they're just people are totally unaware or negligent or insensitive to how much the way you phrase questions and the way you structure questions can influence how people respond to them. And this could give us a really skewed picture in both philosophy and psychology. I said a lot there, so I guess I'll stop with that.
Well, like you said, your dealio is more with metaethics. So what are if you really wanted to understand someone's metaethical view, if they even had one, what's the line of question you'd undergo?
So what I think the best approach would be some type of semi-structured interview. That would be, you could call it a kind of I think I might have seen something like this in a paper. So the paper that's coming to mind is, I think, The Past and Future of Experimental Philosophy by Nadelhofer and Namias. I think that's the authors. Anyway, that's a paper that's responding to this other paper that had a huge influence on me, The Rise and Fall of Experimental Philosophy. But basically what they talk about in that paper is kind of proposing this sort of discussion you could have with people. It's almost like anthropology. You have the choice, if you want, when you're asking people questions, to give them multiple choice or to ask a single question. But to really understand a person's philosophical perspective, you typically need a type of dialogue. And so if you were even trying to do something more robust than just a survey, you're trying to do a sort of structured interview. If you're doing a structured interview and you have a set of questions and you ask a question and they go, I don't understand the question. Too bad, question two. So there's not a whole lot you can do. What you want to be able to do is to ask people questions and then maybe clarify, or they might say, I'm not sure. And you could offer, and you do have a trade-off and a risk here of biasing the person, some degree of clarification to help them answer your questions. And so it would have this kind of Socratic dialectical feature to it that would allow you to ask follow-up questions to sort of drill down and get at the truth of what that person thinks. And what that allows you to do is flexibly adapt the kinds of questions you're asking, the way you're speaking, to the person in particular that you're talking to. Different people will have different concerns, different ways of responding to questions. So are you looking for like a specific line of questioning that you would use? You're muted.
Yeah, how about we do it this way? I have an answer in mind. I want to see if we come with the same answer. In my experiences, there's this question that a lot of people think really illuminates whether your metaethical view. And it's like the all and be all question for discovering what you really think about morality or whatever. What do you hear out there in your conversations and your experience in terms of this question?
The immediate question that comes to mind, and there's like a little cluster of them, is there are questions that are these extremely normatively loaded stuff. So it's going to be stuff like, do you think Hitler was really actually bad, or something like that? It's almost always something like that, where people will hit you with genocide or just the worst type of actions in the world. And they'll either ask, do you think that was really wrong, or was it wrong? Or they might even include metaethical terminology like objectively wrong. Sometimes they'll even use like super fancy technical terms like stance independently wrong. But basically what people will do is they'll take a question, a normative moral question, they'll either tag or imply a realist characterization of that normative view, and then ask you, do you affirm the normative view from the metaethical perspective? So they kind of smush the two together and then see why, like how you'll respond. So let's one that I see people use a lot, and I've used it myself, is like, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? So one second, I'm still having this camera issue where it was like,
oh yeah,
happening on your end.
You're good though.
Okay, so the first thing to get out of the way about that is sometimes people say, why do people use examples like that? And there's a couple good reasons why people ask questions like that. First, why do they say torture babies? And then they add that just for fun part. Because one of the annoying things that will happen is when people fight the hypothetical. And so sometimes what will happen is if you give people a question like, do you think it's wrong to steal? People will go, well, what if you had to steal to stop a terrorist attack and you're stealing the weapons so they can't do the terrorist attack? Then it's morally obligatory to do it. And so what they do is they'll take something that was like, it's typically wrong, or the prototypical cases are wrong, and they're coming up with this exception where it wouldn't be wrong, or it might actually be good to do it. And so people, and this is a good thing people do in a certain sense, that they're sensitive to the context, because they're not being absolutists about stealing or lying or whatever. And that's good. Now, you add that for fun part so that you're giving the motivation for it. You're not, that person isn't doing something for some potential, like, would it be wrong to hurt people just for fun? It's easier to say yes than would it be wrong to hurt people? Because someone might say, well, what about cases where it's self-defense or something? So there's a reason why people add stuff about the motivations of the person performing the action. The second thing that explains the rationale behind giving extreme cases is that sometimes people, I guess part of the idea is that what you want to do is evoke a reaction from people where they don't find it easy to just say, no, it's not really wrong. And it's sort of motivationally and psychologically harder to deny that something is wrong like that. And then a third reason that dovetails on that is simply that you want to pick issues where you expect almost anybody you talk to agree with your normative stance about the issue. It would be weird to say, do you think it's objectively wrong to get an abortion? Because then if the person says yes or no, it's no longer clear. Are they giving a normative stance or a metaethical stance? So you want to pick something that you expect broad agreement on. So all of that explains why people ask that kind of question. Anyway, was that the kind of question you had in mind?
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. Yeah. Typically you hear something like, do you think this is really wrong? But it's this distinction that's often used, subjective versus objective, right? Do you think morality is subjective, or do you think the morality is objective? And personally, and maybe I'm missing something here, and I want to get your view, I find that distinction, while it could track the way I think about like big divides in metaethics, to very, very unhelpful. Because it's not quite clear what they mean by objective. It seems like also I could think of subjectivist views that fit a more realist framework. So the question would be, do you think this distinction between objective subjective is as useful as everyone thinks it is when we're asking asking about people's metaethical views?
No, I don't. So I think that objective and subjective are these terms that you hear a lot when people like sort of attempt metaethical discussion. That's not a nice way to put it, but a lot of people engage in disputes about metaethics, and they'll try to dichotomize things in terms of objective and subjective. You'll see some people say stuff like, well, if moral realism isn't true, then morality is subjective. And the first thing to say about that is that subjectivism as a metaethical position has a fairly specific characterization or cluster of characterizations, that it is one among several different anti-realist positions. There's also error theory, non-cognitivism, quasi-realism. My views, there's a variety of different views. And it doesn't look like either people think that's your only option, that type of subjectivism, that specific view, and they just aren't aware of these other views, or they're using subjectivism in a way that is, I guess you could say, like less disciplined. It's not entirely clear what they mean by it. And so they're using these sort of metaethically underdeveloped and sort of foggy terms that don't actually track the distinctions that exist in the literature. And so they might have in mind a genuinely mutually exhaustive contrast between two views, and they're tagging the cluster of anti-realist views as subjective, but that's not the only anti-realist position. So it's often unclear. So I would say that these often will fall into like three categories. One is they actually have in mind subjectivism and they genuinely think that's your only anti-realist option. That's wrong. And if they're doing that, they shouldn't do that. That's just incorrect. Or they have in mind like all types of anti-realism, and they're just using subjectivism to encompass them all. And they're just open to there being a variety of positions. And that's fine. That's just like sloppy terminological use. Or three, it's just kind of indeterminate. They're just using the language in such a sloppy and like undisciplined way. You just don't know what they mean. And so I think generally that's going on there. Then on the objectivity side, often people will say, well, there really are facts about whether your actions would make people happy or make people sad. And so boom, it's objective. And often what people think they can do is they could get a cheap victory for realism or objectivism by associating morality with some set of identifiable objective facts. The problem is that what they often do is they'll pick, often by stipulation or arbitrarily, some standard. They'll say moral facts are facts about well-being. There are facts about well-being, so there are moral facts. QED, I win. Now, there are analytic naturalist accounts that try to make a sort of philosophical defense of why they associate the moral facts with certain natural facts. And that's fine if you're doing that with like self-consciously, like, yeah, I really do think that the moral claims just are claims about well-being or suffering. But other times, like in these sorts of discussions, people just think they could point to facts associated with morality, point out that the facts are objective, and then say, therefore, there's objective moral facts. And I think that's missing what, it's both missing what really makes non-naturalist realist accounts important. So like distinctive. I feel like I'm throwing out terminology here that people aren't going to be familiar with, but I guess we could get to some of it. Basically, I think people are just using the terms in sloppy ways. Another thing that people will do to flip back over to the subjective side is they'll think that if your moral beliefs are held from a point of view, then they are subjective, so subjectivism wins. And that's ridiculous because like my beliefs about like whether I'm like we're currently having a conversation, that's based on like my perception of the world and what's going on. And so I have that belief on the basis of my subjective experiences. Does that mean whether we're having a conversation or not is a matter of subjectivity? No, that's ridiculous. And so people just take these terms, objective and subjective, they misapply them, they misuse them. And when I say misapply, misuse, I mean that they're using them in confused and sloppy ways that don't track the metaethical literature and that don't really point out meaningful or useful distinctions for anything. And so you just end up in this mire of terminological confusion.
And then the third one, so we got do you think this is really wrong? Do you believe in subjective or objective morality? And then this one, do you think morality is just a matter of opinion? What do you think about that question?
Oh, that's the worst one of all. That one makes me angry. If it was earlier in the day, I would probably jump on my chair and be more angry. I'm too tired for that now. So opinion is the stupidest term ever, in my opinion. And it has no place in these discussions. And here's why. Sometimes people use the term opinion to convey their preferences or their attitudes or things that on reflection they themselves might regard as subjective or as expressions of their emotions or attitudes. So for instance, someone might say, well, my opinion, the meal was delicious. And then if you really had a conversation with the person, you're like, well, do you mean that like on your view, there is a stance independent gastronomic fact about the genuine intrinsic gastronomic positive qualities of the food such that it has superior gastronomic qualities, and you could somehow explain all that to the person, chances are a person might say, no, I don't think that. I'm just telling you I like it, So there are contexts in which people's opinion, like someone expressing an opinion is an expression of their attitudes or their subjective values. Then there are other contexts in which it may express a person's views about some objective matter of fact. So different scientists have different opinions on whether there was ever life on Mars. Now, it's not that, if we're talking about metaethical subjectivism, that is a view that the moral facts are literally made true by your preferences. It's not like when xenobiologists disagree on whether there's life on Mars, that if one prefers that there was life on Mars, then there literally was relative to their view. And that if another person prefers that there wasn't life on Mars, then there literally was not life on Mars relative to that person's view. That's ridiculous. And that's not what people mean when they say, or at least I should say, I don't think people have determinate views about any of this, but that's not a plausible reading of what people would be trying to achieve or accomplish. And it's certainly not a plausible philosophical position, to be like a relativist about whether there was life on Mars or not. So, the issue there is that opinion in one context is used to express preferences, attitudes, or values, and in other contexts, it's used to express positions one has on objective matters of fact or stance-independent matters of fact. Now, so it's used in both of those contexts, so it's useless for distinguishing realists from anti-realists. It's just completely useless. The other thing is that opinion often in everyday discourse serves various sorts of pragmatic functions. And a significant pragmatic function of expressing an opinion is to give deference to the possibility that other people hold views and that you're not going to be angry with them or upset with them or think that they're stupid for holding that view. So if I say, imagine this conversation between two scientists about whether there was life on Mars. And one of the scientists says, there definitely was life on Mars and anybody that disagrees is a moron. That's one way they could frame it. Someone could say, well, in my opinion, there was life on Mars. And what we see is that when a person's doing that, if someone goes, well, in my opinion, there wasn't, you would not expect as much like hostile exchange following that, because the person, what they're trying to do when they say, in my opinion, is to say, look, this is my position on this stance-independent matter of fact, this objective matter of fact. And the implication is, if you have a contrary opinion, that's okay too. And so it's serving a social role of basically saying you're receptive to or open to or tolerant to people holding contrary views.
They're trying to be humble, right? There's an
element of it's epistemic humility. It's used to, to signal epistemic humility. And so what philosophers are really stupid and dumb and terrible at is appreciating that everyday, ordinary language has all these it's pragmatics everywhere. It's just all these pragmatic things going on, all these social things going on. And the way that people use language, just that's an essential feature of what it's for, what it's doing. And it's not some parasitic extra stuff. And if we peel that all away, we'll get at the true, pure semantics. I don't think that's how everyday language works. Everyday language is the social stuff that you're doing with that. And so when you peel that away, there's nothing left. And so what philosophers are often trying to do is get at this true core meaning to everyday language that sets aside all the pragmatics and looks at the pure semantics. I don't think there is any such thing. And so the efforts on the part of philosophers to try to analyze language is often, in my opinion, fundamentally misguided, because it's based on false presuppositions about how language works. But yeah, the opinion stuff is just super confused. And the reason for that is because the everyday uses of the term serves these sorts of social functions that when you step outside of those social functions and try to regiment the language in a philosophical context, it just doesn't work, because it's ambiguous between exactly the different distinctions that you're trying to use it to judge between. So people will try to use opinion to mean subjective, but in everyday context, you could use the term opinion for non-subjective things. And so it just gets everybody confused. Why would you use language like that?
And of course, there are broader applications of this, but I often talk to theists, and I typically, when they ask me this question, I know they're theists. I'm like, are you asking me if morality is a matter of opinion? Are you including God's opinion? And then, because if you just straight up ask them, okay, well, what do you mean by opinion? You just look like you're being obtuse. But when you ask them, well, does God have opinions? Then they realize there's usages of the term where, like, it'd be weird to say God has no opinions, right? Because we have a usage of the term opinion just to mean like, oh, that's my view, right? Like, if God, like that's a usage. And so if you say God has no opinions, they'll think they think about they reflect on those cases where we use the opinion in terms of views, and then suddenly may not be the case that God has views, which is probably detrimental to considering him to be some kind of agent or mind, but person. So this brings us to, well, then now we're in a conundrum, right? Because these are the terms like preferences, opinions, objective, subjective, really bad, or these are terms that people, are quick to interpret, and feel people feel comfortable in responding to those sorts of questions that have those terms, even though it can, there's probably an element of confusion. So then how do we ask our questions? If we start using, the more technical language, then we lose the crowd, so to speak, right? So is there a way to teeter between these two worlds of, okay, if we go towards these phrases, their confusion, or, that things are less clear and thus confusion enters. But if we go to very technical language just to avoid that confusion, then we just end up, it's a game of, okay, I've never heard this terms. And then we look obtuse, right? And not using the terms that are commonly used when we're asking these sorts of questions. Is there a middle here?
A middle for the purpose of figuring out what non-philosophers think?
And the terms that we use to convey our metaethical commitments?
I think the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what I argue in my dissertation, the title is called Schrodingers Categories. And what I argue there, I have, some phrasing for cashing out what I mean by that, is that I say that the only way to, and I make this comparison to quantum mechanics, like the collapse of the wave function. And it's a play on the idea of like Schrodinger's cat. The cat is indeterminate whether the cat is alive or dead. And that we're not going to get into like exactly that whole thing. So the idea is that people exist. What I say is people exist in a state of philosophical superposition that is only collapsed by engaging in philosophy. In other words, I don't think people have any determinate position on many philosophical issues. I don't know exactly how many or which particular issues. And the only way to find out what that person's position is for that person to develop or acquire a position. And so one of the examples, I actually, it's not just a metaphor, the Schrodinger's idea. I actually literally ran a study on what people without training in quantum mechanics, which quantum mechanical theory they endorse, whether they endorse the many worlds interpretation or the Copenhagen interpretation. Now, if that seems silly to you, it's because it is silly. That's ridiculous. When people go around making causal claims in everyday life, they don't have a position on what the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics is. And yet you can, if you want to, describe the many worlds and Copenhagen interpretations and then ask people to pick one. And when you do that, I reported a little cheekily in the paper, 100% of the people responded. So 100% of people have a view on how to interpret quantum mechanics. That's absurd. And this is, by the way, excluding people that said that they had degrees in physics or already were familiar with the distinctions. So, when you ask people, pick one of these, they'll pick one of them. And I also asked a follow-up question where I said, did you pick one of these answers because you had to and not because it actually reflects your view? I think it was, I don't know if it was like half, but it was a pretty good distribution of people that said yes and people that said no. Now, that gives you two problems. Now, if we're operating on the presumption that people without training in quantum physics do not have views on how to interpret quantum mechanics, they don't have a view on whether the many worlds or Copenhagen interpretation is true. I run a study where I present those ideas to people, and then 100% of them pick one of these views. And then I ask them, did you pick a view that didn't really reflect your view? And they say yes. You've got two things going wrong there. And the interesting thing is that it accounts for 100% of the participants. One is that people were compelled to pick a response even though it doesn't reflect their view. In that case, that's not a valid measure of their view because it's like if I said, what's your favorite fruit, apples or bananas? And 60% of people pick apples, and then I say, 60% of people love apples. That's going to not be true for many of those people because some of them, they like apples better than bananas. Doesn't make it their favorite fruit. They had to pick one. So you have the forced choice people that it's not really their view. And then you have the other people that, okay, let's say for the sake of argument, it really is their view. Okay, well, I asked another question. Do you have a view about how to interpret quantum mechanics? And I asked that prior to them filling out the survey. And for most of these people, they said no, which means, 2 minutes before when they're filling out the survey, hey, do you have a view on how to interpret quantum mechanics? No. Well, here's a little paragraph describing both. Now, which one do you pick? They pick one. Okay, so they form the view in the middle of the study. First of all, is a paragraph summary of quantum mechanical views enough for a person to really understand what they're responding to? I don't know. Let's assume yes. Okay, well, then they've developed a new view about quantum mechanics. So it's at that point, the whole purpose of the study was to tell me, do people without training in quantum mechanics have views about how to interpret quantum mechanics? If telling them about quantum mechanics is good enough for them to have the training that makes them competent judges of which view is correct, then I just made them into like novice quantum physicists, and they're no longer reflective of people prior to participating in the study. If it's not, and they just mistakenly think that they understand it and they actually don't, then their response is moot, because it's like they don't even know what they're responding to. And so you see, it's kind of like lose, 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 whichever way you look. People are answering questions even though it's not their view. People are answering questions because they formed the view by participating in the study, or people are answering questions they think they formed a view, but they're actually confused and they don't understand it. It's one of the three, and none of those are good. And I think that is what happens when you try to ask people without training in metaethics questions about whether they're realists or anti-realists. One, they may just, whatever options you give them, if you say you have to pick A or B, may not reflect their actual views. If you somehow could get past that, you ask them more open-ended questions. You then run into the problem of how do you know if they interpreted your questions in the way that you intended? Well, you might have to ask follow-up questions. You might have to ensure that they interpreted you as intended, and that might require a bit of training. And when you start asking these follow-up questions or exposing people to training, you're going to run into a problem where you could be causing the person to develop the position in the midst of the activity. And this is what I'm talking about when I say people are in this indeterminate state until they engage in philosophy. And what I suspect, and it's very hard to prove this, is that before you actually teach people about the relevant distinctions, these distinctions don't play any role in the way that they speak or the way that they think or in ordinary language. It's just not a part of what people do. Michael Gildes, philosopher, gives a great example in this paper, arguing for indeterminacy about folk metaethics, as well as pluralism. Maybe some people are relativists, some people are realists, but there could also be indeterminacy. What Gill says is, he's like, look, when people make claims about mathematics, we don't typically suppose, I don't think, that they are committed to either Platonism or anti-Platonism about mathematics. That would be ridiculous. That you don't need to have a view about that in order to make mathematical claims, like 2 + 2 = 4. When you're adding up the bill at a restaurant, the tip for the check at a restaurant, you don't have to have a view about, well, what's the metaphysical status of the numbers I'm using. You just don't need to take a position on that. And the same, I think, is just true of metaethics. And I think this is true of many other philosophical issues, where I think that basically philosophers have more or less invented distinctions and categories and concepts that they mistakenly project on to ordinary language and thought. They think it's part of ordinary language and thought. It's not. It's stuff they invented. And then I think they get all huffy when you say, hey, that's not the common sense view. But to call back to the methods we discussed earlier, philosophers will make claims about how ordinary people speak or think, but they don't actually ask anybody or do any research to find out. And when researchers started doing this about 20 years ago, we keep finding philosophers are just wrong.
And just to clarify, I don't think we've actually said it. You're a moral anti-realist.
Yeah.
Okay. And so what you said was, it seems like the question of whether you're a realist or an anti-realist doesn't play very much into the way people talk and engage in their everyday lives. And so this brings us to because I'm an anti-realist as well, and so I'm somewhat critical of some of the antics that moral realists play. The one of them is that they have a monopoly on the terms. And so the idea is that if you're some kind of moral realist, you can't say things are wrong or right or good or bad. And so you're disqualified from participating in, let's say, the claims when we're making about like politics or when we're evaluating past human events and human people, I guess, people. And also that there can't be any kind of moral disagreement. So let's go in that reverse order. So can anti-realist disagree with other moral claims?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And what would be an example of how such a disagreement might look like?
Well, it's going to depend on the anti-realist's position. So there's really simple forms. So if someone says moral anti-realists as a category, like it's an entailment of if you're in the category of anti-realism, that you can't have legitimate, genuine, or real disagreement. Now, legitimate, genuine, or real, already these are loaded terms. Sometimes people just seem to be in disagreement about the stance-independent facts, which of course anti-realists aren't going to disagree about that. They don't think there are any. So they're not going to dispute whether these stance-independent facts are one thing or another, any more than a person that doesn't believe in God is going to dispute what God's favorite color is. God doesn't have a favorite color. So if they're baking that much into it, then sure, then no anti-realists can have any disagreements. If disagreements just are disagreements about stance-independent facts, but anti-realism doesn't entail that one doesn't think that there are moral facts. So if you're a relativist, you could disagree. You actually think that there can be moral facts. You just don't think that they're stance-independent. You think they're potentially stance-dependent. So you have like constructivism and a few other types of accounts according to which there are moral facts. Now, I'll give a simple case of where you can clearly have an anti-realist position and have a disagreement. And this would be cultural relativism. So let's say you have two members of the same culture, and one of them says abortion is morally wrong, and the other says abortion is not morally wrong. Well, according to cultural relativism, whether an action is right or wrong is determined by the standards of the culture. And if both people's claims are referencing the same culture and the same cultural standards, there is some fact about whether abortion is permissible or impermissible by whatever the theory says it is that determines whether abortion is permissible or impermissible. It could be what the majority thinks. It could be what authorities think. There could be some more complicated means by which you determine what like the culture's position on the matter is. But the bottom line is someone could just be like misinformed, you know? So let's say it's a culture where the moral facts are determined by the elders or the authority figures of the society. And there was recently a change, and a person was living in seclusion for many years, and the culture has changed now. And they come back and they say abortion is wrong. And the other person goes, no, abortion is not wrong. Okay, well, now according to society, abortion is not wrong. So they disagree, and one of them is mistaken and one of them is correct. So it's actually really easy, trivially easy to show that there are at least some forms of anti-realism that are completely consistent with, you could say, very conventional claims about moral agreement or disagreement. I should also note, this disagreement is a disagreement about an objective matter of fact. It's a descriptive fact about what the standards of the culture are. Whether or not that fact confers, the people within that society with reasons, or it obligates them in some special way that would have these realist qualities, is a separate question. But the bottom line is you could totally have disagreement. But the other problem is that I think that philosophers often operate on an impoverished conception of what disagreement is or could be. And they often operate under the presumption that disagreements are conflicting claims about what is true. So you're both referring to the same state of affairs, and one of you makes one propositional claim and the other makes a conflicting propositional claim, such that both claims could not simultaneously be true in the same way at the same time. So it could be something like some historical event, Napoleon really did do this or didn't do this. People can disagree about facts like that. They can disagree about, say, mathematical facts, scientific facts. Carbon has 8 protons. No, it has 6. So people can disagree about matters of fact. But there's another type of disagreement that is really, really important. And this is not disagreements about what's true. It's disagreements about what to do. And a lot of disagreements are like this. So if you go and you want to buy a car, and you typically are going to want to pay as little money as you possibly can. But the person selling you the car wants you to pay as much as you're willing to pay. And so you disagree on what the price of the car should be. Does that mean that there must be a correct price of the car that is true independent of either of your goals or values? That car price realism? No, that's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous view. It would be absurd to insist that there's a true price of the car independent of anybody's goals. There is simply possibly a range of prices you would both agree on, and then ranges of prices one would consider too high or too low. And when you disagree, you're not disagreeing on what's true. What you're disagreeing about is about like it's a matter of negotiation. There are other issues where other sorts of disagreements that arise. Let's say you and a group of friends want to order pizza. You may have to negotiate, or you're trying to figure out where to go to eat. So like these practical decisions, someone might say, oh, well, don't get mushrooms on the pizza. I hate mushrooms. Another person might say, I don't want cheese on the pizza. I'm a vegan. And so you negotiate. You disagree about what pizzas you should get. And you don't have to think there is a fact of the matter independent of your goals and standards about what kind of pizza toppings to get. You're actually navigating your goals and desires, and you're reaching compromises. So it's not like you're just saying, because sometimes realists will treat anti-realists that are just expressing their subjective preferences as if people are these like stupid robots. So like, let's say, Danny, you and I were trying to order a pizza. Do you like pineapple on pizza?
No.
Okay, I like pineapple on pizza. So if we got to order one pizza, and I'm like, I want pineapple on it, what would you say?
We can do half. But
Okay,
no.
that's a good way to compromise. Well, I want pineapple on the whole pizza, and I want you to eat it.
No, I disagree.
Okay, so we don't have to think that there is an objectively correct like pizza topping to get in this scenario. We have different goals and desires, and they've come into conflict with one another. And now we have a few options about how to what to do at that point. Now, it would be really stupid to think that what I'm doing when I'm having a discussion with you about pizza toppings in this context where we're trying to order a pizza is I'm like, Danny, I would like to officially inform you that I prefer pineapple on pizza. That's it? I'm just telling you a fact? No, we don't just tell people facts. When people have discussions, and this is about almost anything. Go back to the scientists arguing about whether there's life on Mars or not. They're not just like, oh, I think this is true. Well, I think this is not true. That's going to occur in some social context where they're arguing about that for a reason. There's some reason why they're arguing. Now, imagine one of them is convinced there's no life on Mars, and you can imagine a plausible context. The other one is saying, I'm convinced there's life on Mars. We need to send another Mars rover there, and we need to raise money for this project. And the other one is saying, that's stupid. We've already looked a bunch of times. There is no life on Mars, or that we haven't found any evidence, and it's pointless to keep looking. Let's go check out Europa or something. And so they're disagreeing about the facts for some goal or purpose. I actually think goals and purposes are central to disagreements most of the time, not a pointless dispute about what the facts are. So I actually think it's not just that anti-realists can disagree about moral issues. I actually think they have a better characterization of moral disagreements, which is that morality isn't just this dead, inert thing where we're just like, I think this is true. I think it is not true. We're trying to figure out what the hell to do. Did philosophers forget that? And so when as an anti-realist, I'm telling you about my moral standards, I'm not just going around just informing people. I am against stealing. I am against lying. I am against torturing babies just for fun. I don't want people to do these things. I want there to be policies, and I want to stop people. Is someone doing it over there? Let's go stop them. All of my positions about what's true is actually subordinate to my goals and my attitudes and my objectives and what I'm trying to achieve. And so disagreements can simply be about disagreements about what to do. And morality is pretty, I mean, look, philosophers love to make their claims about what's self-evident or obvious or clear. Morality is obviously about how to live our lives, what policies to make, what laws to make, what we should do, what kinds of people we should be. It's obviously a practical enterprise. And there's absolutely nothing about not thinking that there are these facts that have nothing to do with my goals and desires that prevent me from having stances with respect to my goals and desires, acting on them, discovering that I come into conflict with people. Just like if we get to order one pizza and you don't want pineapple on it, that's a problem for me if I want pineapple on it. We then have to coordinate, compromise, and negotiate with one another. And so the anti-realist actually has a more natural framework for characterizing the actual nature of morality, which is this practical, deliberative matter of compromise with people that have conflicting values. It's better at handling disagreement. And I think that philosophers just have this overly decontextualized approach towards disagreement where they construe disagreement as if we're all just proposition machines and we just go around spewing propositions and that's the only thing that we do. And this is a profoundly like non-human, and honestly, it's weird. It's weird how realists became so convinced they handle disagreement better than anti-realists. I actually think that their conception is totally bizarre, super weird, totally out of accord with how actual human conduct and action works in the real world. And it's not just that they're wrong when they say that anti-realists can't have disagreements. It's like they're the opposite of right. They have a totally bizarre conception of disagreement.
But Lance, you see, we're talking about morality. I don't know why you're bringing in pineapples and food taste to make your points, as per this comment.
I don't know what their point is.
Well, I think their point is that you're trying to show you're trying to diffuse an objection that about how could you disagree on let's say a subjectivist moral framework where we're just it's one preference over another. Number one, is that genuine disagreement? Number two, is there ways to resolve the sort of conflicts? And you're using examples of how there could be disagreement on, or how we could understand a conflict when we're talking about pizza or food preferences or food taste. And so what Amir is thinking here, the person that's commented here, is that suddenly you're using a comparison between morality and food taste. And so and they're using the fact that there seems to be such a disparity between, should we, provide health care to our citizens, from like, should there be pineapple on pizza, to undermine your response to that objection. What do you think about that?
I don't see how it undermines anything that I've said. So, sometimes what people will do, and I don't know if Amir is doing this, so I'm not going to say that they are. Sometimes people will say stuff like, are you comparing like murder to ice cream flavors? And when people do that, that at least shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the purpose of a comparison. When I'm making comparisons between, first of all, what I'm trying to do is show that the notion of a disagreement can be construed in at least two different ways. There could be disagreements about propositions, like two people, as I said before, can both be trying to refer to the same considerations or sets of putative facts, and then they could disagree about what the facts are. So someone could disagree about whether or not, Caesar crossed the Rubicon in a particular day. And someone says he did, someone says he didn't. And there could be disagreement about that, where it's simply, is this proposition true, or is this conflicting proposition true? But there's another type of disagreement, which is a practical disagreement, you could call it. It's a disagreement about what to do. And what I'm saying is that anti-realists can and do engage in disagreements about what to do, about practical disagreements. So that doesn't require me to use analogies to food or whatever. So that's the first thing, is that I give those things as examples of cases where we already do this, to show that, hey, this is a pretty natural thing we already do. We already engage in practical disagreements in non-moral contexts. So, consider that you could engage in practical disputes in moral contexts. And sometimes people do engage in, even if you're a realist, there's still going to be practical moral questions about what to do. It'd be pretty weird if realists didn't think that there were practical disagreements. Now, for a realist, they might just think that the practical disagreements are subordinate to you could say, the propositional disagreements. So what you should do, practically speaking, is just whatever the moral facts say you should do, just conform to whatever the moral facts are. But that's not necessary conceptually, logically, in the moral domain. I think if it seems to not be necessary in non-moral domains, like deciding what to eat. It'd be really weird, I think, to say, just really implausible to say that if you and I are trying to figure out what pizza toppings to get, that there must we must be deliberating about what the true gastronomic facts are, or we just couldn't do it. So part of the reason to give those examples is to illustrate how it's conceptually possible to think about making non-moral evaluative judgments, to engage in non-moral deliberation about what to do and how to reason about normative and evaluative issues. And so if you could do that in those other domains, it would be a little strange to say this is absurd or impossible to do in the moral domain. You might think it's incorrect or inappropriate to do in the moral domain, but that's a different issue. The other thing has to do with the nature of comparisons, which is that when I'm making this comparison and I'm saying, hey, there are these meta-normative, there are these characteristics about the fundamental nature of evaluation and judgment and deliberation about food. Hey, when it comes to deciding what I'm going to eat, if you set aside nutrition and cost and those sorts of things, typically what I do when I'm choosing what to eat for taste reasons, I choose things on the basis of my desires, what I want to eat. So if there's two things, all else being equal, and one of them tastes better than the other to me, I'm going to pick the one that tastes better to me. And you can analogize that to morality. When I'm trying to make a moral decision, I choose the action that's most consistent with my moral values. Now, when you make that comparison, what you're doing is you're saying, hey, in both cases, I act in accordance with what my subjective values are. But sometimes when you make that comparison, people think that you're comparing, say, food preferences, like what I'm going to eat at a restaurant, and moral issues in terms of other things, such as their importance or their centrality to our lives. And so they might think if you're talking about ice cream flavors as a comparison to baby torture, they're thinking you're saying, yeah, these are about equally important to me. I wake up in the morning, vanilla chocolate. If I want vanilla, but there's only chocolate, I'll take the chocolate. If my options are baby torture or no baby torture, whatever. It's not that big of a deal. So they think that you're comparing them in terms of importance, and you're not making that comparison. When a person compares two things and says these things are alike in these ways, this does not require, entail, or even imply that you think that they're similar in any other ways. And yet people will often think, oh my God, you're comparing X to Y, and they say it with incredulity, as if you're saying these things are equally valuable, these things are equally important, but that's just not what you're doing in the comparison. I don't know if that addresses that particular.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's pretty simple. It's that they want to say that, okay, let's say someone has a position that morality is a function of preference. They want to say you can't have disagreement if it's a matter of preference. You give a counterexample where you can understand disagreement in terms of preferences. But yeah, it's in the domain of food taste, but that still doesn't matter what domain that it's in terms of the type of values or preferences that we're talking about. It's going to count as it's going to count as a counterexample to the claim that you can't understand disagreement, and if it's a matter of preference. It's very simple.
Right. You've vastly simplified it. Yeah. It's conceptually possible to construe disagreement in a way completely consistent with virtually every form of moral anti-realism. There's absolutely no problem with that. A realist could say that that's a bad way of construing it. It's an incorrect way of construing it. It's not the proper account. Realism is true. I'm not disputing any of that. All I would say is that if someone's saying this is like conceptually impossible or bizarre or weird, that's just wrong. It's just not true.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us to you characterized morality in terms of, moral realism, anti-realism in terms of whether, if there are moral facts, whether they're stance independent or not. And so you were the first one that I heard this phrase, stance independent, stance dependent. I had been using mind independent, mind dependent. And I do prefer your terminology, but I think at some point I did ask you if those track the same stuff, like stances or mind. I don't remember your response to that. So number one, are those the same thing? If not, which one? Why have we moved on to that presenting that economy that way?
I can only speculate about why we moved on. I mean, you said my terminology. This terminology didn't originate with me. If I recall, and memory is really faulty, I believe I came across the terminology in Russ Schaefer-Landau's work. Russ Schaefer-Landau is a moral realist, but I may have encountered it in discussions or somewhere prior to that, and then looked it up to say, who used this term? Where did it originate from? As far as I could tell, it looks like the term started being popularized by Schaefer-Landau in the 90s, and it seems to be taking off. I don't know if I'm just riding the wave of its popularity, or in local circles I talk in, other people have started using the term. I don't know what's driving it sort of sweeping up the metaethical discourse. But as far as whether or not it means the same thing as mind independent, I use them interchangeably, and I've definitely seen people use the terms completely interchangeably. They just mean the same thing. They are absolute synonyms. However, some people may use them differently. And some people have also used alternative, like X independent. I believe I've seen humorists say observer independent. And I think that is intended to mean the same thing. As far as why there's been a shift from mind independent to stance independent, I don't know. I've never seen some formal reason. I've never discussed, I don't sit around, I'm not in a philosophy department, so I haven't talked to a lot of philosophers about the sociology of the field. It's super fascinating. So I would love to hang out in philosophy departments more and talk more to people about what's the history of the field, what's going on in the field. But I'll speculate. I'll hazard a guess. One of the things that happens when you say, realism is the view that moral facts are mind independent, is people will make they'll mistakenly interpret this. And it's an understandable mistake. So it's not like people are being stupid when they interpret it this way. They'll interpret it as the view that there are moral facts that don't have anything to do with people's mental states. And then they'll look at a view like utilitarianism that says, well, moral facts, what makes something right or wrong is whether, it increases happiness or decreases suffering. And they go, well, hold up. Increases in happiness or increases in mental states. Increases in suffering or increases in mental states. You can't be a utilitarian and a moral realist because the moral facts are dependent on the mind. So that's ridiculous. But by the way, this is not true at all. That is totally nonsense. Again, understandable nonsense. Moral realism is not the view that the moral facts have nothing to do with people's mental states. So they're not that whether or not a particular action is right or wrong doesn't depend in certain ways on the presence or absence of particular mental states. That is not what the view is. The view is about the truth makers of moral propositions. It's about what it is that makes a moral claim true. And the moral claim might be something like, in the case of a utilitarian, it is morally good to increase happiness. Whether or not that's true doesn't have to do with states of happiness directly. It's not like that's true if it makes you happy to believe it or something like that. That statement is true independent of anybody's actual mental state. So it'd be true if nobody existed. That's just true like about the world. The same way like 2 + 2 is 4, and you might think it would still be 4 even if nobody existed. It was 2 + 2 was 4 before people invented math. The terminology, it was still true. That's the idea. It's not that the moral facts are like literally fixed by the presence or absence of specific mental states. That's just not what the view is. So I think maybe people switch to stance independent to avoid that particular confusion.
Let's say like you shouldn't drink unicorn blood. You're not saying that there needs to be unicorn blood or a lack of in the world, right? That what grounds the truth of that statement is going to be independent of whether there's, unicorn blood in the. I'm thinking of Harry Potter, so
okay,
yeah. So I'm excited for the new HBO series, but yeah, I see what you're saying there. I think that's what you're saying. No.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess one way though, there are different types of mental states, and people want to say that, like, I know a realist, a self-identified realist, that thinks that what sort of makes, I guess, one of those truth makers involve, like a more phenomenology or a kind of qualitative state rather than any kind of intentional state, like a belief or desire or an intuition or anything like that. And so it seemed like it would be mind dependent, but if we're differentiating qualitative states or phenomenal, the sort of that phenomenology, phenomenal aspect of the mind, I lost my train of thought. The idea of a stance seems to be distinct from like a phenomenal quality or qualia such, but it's still nonetheless mental state. So it would be a mind dependent view, but it would be a stance independent view. Is that how I'm thinking of that? Or when theists use the example of the distinguish between God's nature, which is supposed to be of God's mind or subject, but not a matter of God's intentional states, like is God's desires or will or anything like that. That would be maybe a better example.
Okay.
So I wanted to show you this tweet. Now, it might be that we can't make sense of the tweet, and that's fine, because I just thought about it. This is not a surprise attack on poor Lance, but on the terminology, and this is from like a theistic point of view. I wanted to see what you thought about it. Let me pull it up.
Is it going to make me angry?
No. All right, let me zoom in. Okay, give me a second. Okay. So the context, this is the context. The way divine command theorists assume that we're talking about is objective morality never ceases to amaze me. Okay. So I think I've seen you, sort of get at this, that moral realism seems to be in conflict with the idea that you think that these truths about what we should or shouldn't do is a matter of God's stances. And so, in what sense would it be moral realism if so? This is sort of the context. So here's a Christian friend of mine. I'll read it. I'm dumb, so there's probably an easy fix for my wayward confusion, but the way critics have modified divine command theory assume that their criticism has anything to do with a view that God's nature as being stance independent never ceases to amaze me. PSA, the reason stance independent has been seized upon by Metaethics is because the kind of objectivity is what takes care of the worries of arbitrariness and contingency. This would be recalibrated if the majority of Metaethics were formulating the criterion with God in mind, but they aren't, so they won't. Now, if you don't have much comments on this, I wanted to know what you thought of specifically about the change in language as taking care of arbitrariness and contingency. I didn't know if you had anything to say about that.
Yeah, I actually got to say, I actually find that pretty plausible. So you know, the distinction for me between realism and anti-realism is a very bright, distinct line within their perimeters. I mean, it's philosophy, so nothing is actually so bright or distinct. But roughly it comes down to, are there stance independent moral facts? Yes, you're a realist. No, you're an anti-realist. Simple as that. You get some of these like weird edge cases, and divine command theory is one of these edge cases. Now, it's possible to construe divine command theory in a variety of different ways, and you could, in principle, construe it in a way where it's very clearly a type of realism or a type of anti-realism. I think it's a little easier to clearly make it a type of anti-realism. You could just say, look, God has stances on issues; those stances determine the moral facts. If that's your view, that's a type of anti-realism. It's what you could call a relation designating account, as per, there's a reference that Richard Joyce gives in this really good supplement that was removed from the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on moral anti-realism. I always reference it, but it's really great. So I don't know, I'll have to talk about that sometime. But roughly that works like this. Those accounts are a type of anti-realism that there are moral facts, and it's not a type of relativism. So you can have a type of anti-realism with non-relative moral facts. And that might seem really weird to people, but it's not. You could have a really silly version. Imagine, I think Don Loeb gives an example like this, and I've seen other people give an example, that you think that the moral facts are determined by what's on Steve's list. So Steve, it's just Steve is like the guy that works down the street. So Steve just writes on the list like what he thinks the moral facts are. Whatever's on that list, those are the moral facts. Well, if you endorse that view, you're not a relativist because there's one list of correct facts. There's only one standard. Now, what makes a view a relativist view is that the truth of moral claims is indexed to one of like multiple possible different perspectives in principle. It could be there's only one person, and relativism would still be like true. But what moral relativism allows you to do is to index moral claims. I'll give an example. When people talk about, like, if someone says like, I am facing north, they're indexing that by using the word I. And so one person could be facing north, and then the statement, when they say I'm facing north, is true. Another person is not facing north, they're facing south. If they say I'm facing north, it's false. And so you could have two people make the same claim, but one claim is true and one claim is false because the use of the term I is indexed to two different perspectives. The two people are facing different directions, and so you get two different truth values. Relativism allows the truth status of the claim to vary in accordance with who or what it is indexed to. If you have a divine command theory and all the moral facts are determined by God's stances, there is no indexing. The truth and status of the moral claims cannot vary. So you have a single correct body of moral facts, but they're still stance dependent. So it's a type of anti-realism. Now, sometimes what I've seen theists do, and I don't see that happening here, but I'll get to the arbitrariness, is they'll say, it's moral facts aren't dependent on human stances. What the heck? That just seems super ad hoc. Like you're just carving out the space. It's not depending on these people's stances. Now, when they say human, I often that it seems, if you're trying to be super uncharitable, if they're really just human. So moral facts can depend on like the stances of elves and hobbits. So if like Bilbo says it's wrong, then it's you got a type of moral realism. I mean, that's silly. Like that it has to be specifically like it's only realism if it's exempted from human stances, but anything else's stances count. That's absurd. So maybe people, like a more charitable reading would be something like the stances of finite beings or the stances of limited, non-God type beings. It not just humans, but like if we ran into aliens, they can't make moral realism true by having stances. So often they'll sort of carve out the special space for God, and they'll say, no, it's still a type of moral realism, even if the moral facts depend on God's stances. That just strikes me as idiosyncratic and weird, and it's a weird way of carving up the conceptual space. But there's nothing like, it's not incorrect. If you just want to say, by moral realism, I mean moral facts that aren't dependent on the stances of finite beings. And so the moral facts are dependent on God's stances, but God's not a finite being. So boom, it's a type of moral realism. You could do that if you want. I would consider that a type of anti-realism. However, here's the thing. What realists are motivated by a concern for in practice is that they don't want the moral facts to be arbitrary. They don't want them to be relativized. They don't want them to vary. They don't want them to just be contingent. They want those moral facts to be necessary or unchanging or eternal. They don't want the moral facts to be, you could say like I I mean, they certainly don't want them to be whimsical, like, hi, today it's okay to do this. But they don't want them even like to change after considered cultural revolutions or something. They want those moral facts to be free from that sort of vagaries of cultural change, attitude change, preference. They don't want them to be contingent. Bottom line. And if you have this thing where the moral facts are dependent on God's stances, but God's stances are determined by God's nature, and God's nature is eternal and unchanging, you do solve the problem of them being arbitrary and contingent. They're no longer arbitrary and contingent, even if they're dependent on a stance. And so even if we want to say, like, on a technicality, it's a type of anti-realism, the type of moral facts it furnishes us with are different in some really important ways from the types of moral facts you get out of a relativistic view or other sorts of views. And so that, I think, at least, and so I think that's the kind of point they're getting at here. And I think there's something to that.
Yeah. So what he's saying is that, or what you were saying is, you were sort of agreeing with them. If you want to be a more realist, but it's sort of it's discomforting at thinking of the moral facts as being relativized to something else, because that brings up the issue of, well, then there could be some kind of change or sense of contingency. Then, there's this change or this move to stance independency in a way where there's like less room for relativism. Is that how I understood you?
Less room for relativism.
Because I'm thinking of, okay, so I'm trying to understand the tweet. Sorry. So specifically this part, what is he saying here? That he's saying that.
Yeah, saying basically what I said. So if the stance independent, so the idea here is that, okay, so realists want, let's say you want your view is there's got to be these moral facts and they're not arbitrary and contingent. Okay, so they don't depend on people's stances. That makes them non-arbitrary,
right,
and non-contingent. Now, if you say, okay, well, then what are they? And you say, okay, actually, they are dependent on God's stances, but God's stances aren't arbitrary or contingent. That also solves the problem. So you can have here's two solutions to, let's say your view is, I don't want arbitrary and contingent moral standards. You have two options here. They're not dependent on stances at all. That's one way, and that's what they're pointing to. Secular moral philosophers want them stance independent. That solves the problem. Another way to solve the problem is they are dependent on stances. They're just dependent on the stances of a being whose stances aren't arbitrary or contingent.
Right. Okay. I understood you. I just I guess I confused relativism. I used the term relativism just to mean depend on stances, which was a mistake. But
but it's not the same thing.
Right.
So that does solve those problems. Here's the thing. I still think you're going to have a problem on the realist views. Now, naturalists already have this problem, naturalist realists. But okay, let's say that God exists, God has stances on what's right or wrong. God's stances aren't arbitrary or contingent. Okay, why should I follow the stances? Why should I care? So realists are still going to run into the problem of basically the who gives a shit objection. It's not just that I'm not interested in following the objective moral facts. I, as a matter of fact, won't follow the objective moral facts unless they already align with what I wanted to do anyway. They are motivationally superfluous. They don't do anything. They don't move me at all. And I think that this is probably just generally true of people. It doesn't have to be. A person could think, I want to do whatever the moral facts are. And if the moral facts are screaming tables all day, they'll do it. I wouldn't. I'm pretty sure. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think I would do that. So, imagine God comes down and says, do all these terrible things, torture babies for fun. Yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. To hell with the moral facts then. So I think that so you have that issue, you have the motivation issue, but the deepest issue, I think, is that I still want to ask on these views, are the facts in question irreducibly normative? Are they facts about what you should or shouldn't do, or what's good or bad? You could say irreducibly evaluative if you want. And that cannot be reduced to or redescribed in descriptive terms. If the answer to that is yes, there are facts of that kind, then I think it's unintelligible. It just doesn't make sense. I think that's conceptually confused.
Okay, well, we're wrapping up the stream. I do want to say that Lance will be back to debate a moral realist. I will try to get MJ. The tweet I just made, he's I think he's a moral realist, but he's definitely some adherent of divine command theory, or I think they're calling it theistic voluntarism or something like that. So I'm going to invite him to talk with you, Lance, and hopefully we'll get that set up on my channel. But yeah, this is there'll definitely be a part 2 because we're wrapping up on an hour and 20 minutes. But
Okay, no problem.
all right.
That's a good idea.
Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. Lance not only just got a TikTok, but he's had a YouTube channel. Do you want to talk a little bit about how to find you?
Yeah, just look up Lance Independent and you'll find me in like just search for the YouTube videos. You can find me there. Yeah, and then I'm on TikTok. I'm also Lance Independent there, and I have a blog also called Lance Independent. I'm being consistent with the branding, so I'm easy to find.
Alrighty, everyone, have a great night. I hope you all enjoyed the show. See y'all.